I've always been interested in the relationship between the stories we consume through the media and how we build those stories in our mind as a way of understanding the world that we live in, and then how that influences how we interact with the real world. And so part of my research is on how we process and understand narratives. And then the other part that more specifically is how we perceive stories to be more or less realistic, or if in fact we do perceive stories as being realistic, or in fact if all stories are realistic or real to us until we think, wait a minute, maybe that's not the case. And recently I've been doing some research on the relationship between perceiving something as unrealistic and how that's like being deceived, and how that's related to deception. So right now I'm working on this relationship between the perceived realism of stories and the idea of deception, and how we process or how we detect deception. I find that one of the best ways to teach, and not all content or not all lessons work this way, but an awful lot of what we how we see the world comes in the form of stories. And so I like to teach by kind of telling stories. And it's tricky because you have to be careful that you don't just wind up telling your own stories. But I think it's useful at the graduate level. I think it's kind of similar, right? So what's the story of how a theory came to be? And how does that theory tell a story of how we are, how we communicate, how we interact with media, how we do whatever we do. And in fact, that's also true when you look at studies, right? If you look at an individual research study that we read a lot of in our graduate courses, often the study is kind of a story. I think the biggest challenge that graduate students have is learning to think about the relationship between the construct that they're interested in. What is this thing that I want to study? And how they're going to measure that thing. I find that fascinating, and I think it's really challenging. I think we see an awful lot of research, and we see an awful lot of people struggle with, here's what I want to know about. And then by the time you get to the level of measurement, or the measurement that you're using to understand that thing, the gap got too big. And we've lost that relationship. And you say, well, we have some data, but I'm not really sure the data apply to the thing you were thinking of. And sometimes people, they're honest. I mean, I'll be honest, and I'll say, yeah, that really wasn't it, was it? And it's really about disciplined thinking. So that's what I think students struggle with, and I think we all struggle with it. And I find that important, and I find it interesting to think about. So